Welcome back to Market Madness. Ben Jacobs with you, and of course Olivia Bazaglo and Joel Bayer as well. And we move on now to a one-on-one chat with a top journalist, Mike Keegan from the Daily Mail, and we're going to be focusing on Manchester United, but also first his beloved Oldham Athletic. Mike, great to see you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Well, it was a Happy New Year, Ben, until you mentioned Oldham Athletic.
Well, let's start with that. I know you may not want to speak about results on the field, but why are you an Oldham Athletic fan?
It's a question I often get asked, and it's not. So let's just say it's not something you choose, Ben, if you weren't from Oldham or if you didn't have a close connection to the town. So yeah, that's where I'm from. That's who my dad supported. That's who my grandparents supported. So it's kind of, it's yours through the good and the bad, and you're stuck with it. My dad passed away last year, but I used to say to him, God, because Oldham, for those of your listeners who aren't aware, you can literally have 1 foot in Oldham and 1 foot in Manchester. Like, I went to school in Manchester. I was the only Oldham fan in my year, and that was at a time when we were really good. So I used to say to my dad, could you not have just kept me in the car for another 10 minutes and taken me to City or United? But look, we had some good times. When I was a kid, we were the founder member of the Premier League. I've seen us at Wembley. We had a couple of great semi-finals against Manchester United where we got robbed on both occasions. And that's it, really. You're stuck with them. So we now have not had a promotion since 1991. That's the last time, which I think is longer than any club in England. We have the distinction that they will never be able to take away from us of being the first team to go from the Premier League out of the league itself. We've had some horrendous times. We had an owner who I won't go into too much detail about because we'll be here all day, but he was an absolute disaster. And under his watch, we got relegated twice. He brought in a load of players from overseas that were just never going to work. Paul Scholes, who's an Oldham fan, was our manager, and he lasted about 9 weeks. And we finally managed to get a new owner, but not before we dropped out of the league, sadly. So we're now under the ownership of a local family, Frank Rothwell, who's an absolute legend. This is the guy he's in his 70s. He rowed across the Atlantic single-handedly and raised about 15 million, not 50 million, $1.5 million for Alzheimer's. So we've gone from, the worst owner that we could have to the best owner. We've now got a manager that's getting us going back in the right direction. And there's a real feel-good factor about it, Ben. We see a lot of younger people who come to Oldham as well as going to United and City because you can get close to it. The atmosphere is great. And we're getting crowds. Like, we were due to play York on Boxing Day, who are our rivals to get promoted this year. I think we were going to get 9,500 in. So when you think about, outside of England, there aren't many countries where the fifth tier, you could get close to 10,000 people watching games. So it's mine for the good and the bad. Sadly, there's been a lot more bad than good over the past couple of decades, but fingers crossed, we're back in the right direction because there is nothing like seeing your team get a good result.
Do you sort of look at the Wrexham story and one or two other clubs coming from non-league, the National League, up the football pyramid and think that's still possible with a club like Oldham under this ownership?
Yeah, absolutely. I think our kind of, you're clouded by where you think your club should be. I always think from where they were when you were between the ages of 6 and 16. I think that's when you kind of feel, right, this is my... So for me, that's Premier League, Championship. Now, I'm not stupid enough the way that football has progressed to think that Oldham's natural place is the Premier League or the Championship. However, we are really, based on town size, ground capacity, support, we should be in League One. And I don't see, once we get some momentum, we've seen it with Wrexham, we've seen it with Stockport. We've not got the funding that those two have got, but we've got proper owners who are, having a decent go. Our budget is very good for the National League. And the difference now, Ben, between the National League and League Two is almost non-existent. It's an absolute disgrace, if I'm being honest, that only 2 clubs come up from the National League. That needs fixing as soon as possible. And I don't want to get too political, but when you've got the EFL trying to get more money out of the Premier League and the football regulator incoming, they should be sorting something out on their own doorstep first, which is to make it fair for those clubs coming out of the National League. But as I said, we've seen it with the clubs that have come up. The difference just isn't that great. Your Notts County I would throw into there as well. So, with a fair wind, without it taking too long, hopefully we'll see them back in League One.
And just lastly on Oldham, I remember the Premier League days that you've alluded to, Boundary Park, the plastic pitch. Were those some of your memories as a fan rather than a journalist? And even if you go back a bit earlier than that time, what were the kind of first games that maybe like you and your dad were going to together to watch?
So you don't forget your first game, and my dad was reluctant to take me because it was the 80s and hooliganism was rife. And I remember Man City was our big rivalry back in the day, and there was a reluctance to go just because you could pretty much guarantee there'd always be a bit of trouble. And I remember I'd beg him, and he used to, on a Saturday they were at home, the compromise would be while the game was on, he'd drive past the stadium. It's called Sheepfoot Lane that backs onto the main stand, and there was a gate there where you could see one of the goals. And he used to let me out, and I'd run to the gate and have 2 minutes looking through the gate. And Andy Gorham was Oldham goalkeeper at the time, and I'll never forget one of my first memories. Andy Gorham would always be like on his haunches, and he'd always have a yellow goalie jersey on. And those were my first memories. But then he relented. Last game of the season, we were playing Carlisle United at home, and this was 1986. And I think his thinking was that Carlisle United had already been relegated, and it was our last game of the season. There was not really much to play for. So it was a safe environment to bring your kid. And I got there, and I shouldn't laugh. There was a massive scrap in the Carlisle end. The game ended up getting held up. Carlisle's manager, who was like a legend from the 60s, a guy called Bob Stokoe, had to go on the pitch and plead for calm in the away end. And yeah, I'll never forget that. And then my first away game was a couple of years later, I think, at Main Road against Manchester City. And this will show you how times have changed. My first Oldham away game was a 4-1 victory at Manchester City. And I can see it now. Roger Palmer got a hat-trick. And yeah, they can never take that away from us.
That's incredible. Love that memory. My first was Leicester Newcastle pitch invasion, Newcastle staying up. And even though I'm a Leicester fan, I was just wowed by the away supporters in the old Filbert Street in the shed end running onto the field. And I'll never forget that either. But let's move on to Manchester United, because, of course, if we remove the fan from you and go to the journalist, you're a top Manchester journalist covering both the blue and the red half. And I want to focus on Manchester United. What have you made of Ruben Amorim so far?
Really impressed. Really impressed. It feels like they've got someone in there who's grown up, who gets it, who's great with the media. He really has been. I think he was tested. And I think Gary Neville nailed it on Sky when they had some awful results pretty early in his tenure. And Neville said, there is a positive to come from this. And that's that these players have not been able to pull the wool over Ruben Amorim's eyes, as has happened. You know, we saw it with Ten Hag. We saw it with Solskjaer. They went on that incredible run that ended with Solskjaer getting the job. Ruben Amorim was under absolutely no illusions pretty early on about what he needs to improve at Old Trafford. I think it will take a lot of time. I think they're going to need a lot of windows to fix the problem. But to be the Manchester United back, and I know it's a bit of a cliche, it's Manchester United. In my opinion, it's the biggest football club in the world. So for you to be manager of that football club, you need to carry yourself in a certain way. You need to have a certain charisma. And I think and obviously it's very early, but the early signs are that Ruben Amorim is the man for this job, and it's a big job.
And a quick word on the manner in which he was appointed. My understanding is that Manchester United essentially went to Sporting and said, you've got to move now or the job offer doesn't exist. But you broke large parts of this deal, how it came about, what the compensation was like. What did you make of the U-turn on Ten Hag after a summer review, and then this sudden and quick and very decisive move for Ruben Amorim? And do you kind of sense in some ways that might have been down to the fact that maybe Manchester City were also looking at the same candidate?
You speak to people at Manchester City, and it won't surprise you to hear that they say, no, that's not the case. You know, he wasn't for us. Take from that what you will. This was clearly a man who was in demand. Before he turned up at Old Trafford, I had heard his name mentioned with regards to successors for Pep Guardiola. And it's football, you know, things change all the time. So people can tell you stuff with a straight face, and it'll stand up because things change. with the way that United went about the business, I think we're seeing more and more of this. When Sir Jim Ratcliffe and Ineos came on board, I thought it might be a good idea to look at Ineos and the way that they worked. And there's also a book that was sanctioned by Sir Jim Ratcliffe that came out not too long ago on the Ineos way. And it featured the Ineos compass that's been well reported, the values, the things that they hold in quite high esteem, behaviours that they don't like. And one of the things that I was told was that this is a guy who wants to get things done, and he wants to get things done quickly. So he's in his early 70s. This isn't a legacy thing. He doesn't want to, he's a lifelong Manchester United fan. He doesn't want to come in and make all these changes, build a new stadium, get United back to where they want to be for other generations to enjoy. He wants to see this himself. So I think we kind of had an indication with the Dan Ashworth situation. They went in and got him, and then they quite quickly realised that this wasn't a great fit for either side. And they were decisive, and they got rid of him. So, one of the other things that somebody from within Ineos said to me is that, and you can take this or leave it, but the main desire here for Sir Jim Ratcliffe is not a play to make money. He's made his money. He's, an incredibly successful businessman, one of the richest men, if not the richest man in Britain. He's a Manchester United fan. He wants things to work. So I think with Ten Hag, similar to Ashworth, they made the call to keep him on, to give him the extra year after the FA Cup final. We can criticise it now with the benefit of hindsight. Clearly, it wasn't the right move. But at the time, I was at that FA Cup final with a load of friends who were United fans, and we went for a meal after the game. Try telling those United fans that they shouldn't keep Erik Ten Hag. So they let emotion dictate that a little bit. They were hoping for the best. They went out and backed the manager. They gave him the extra contract. But crucially, when it became clear that this wasn't working, they acted quickly. And at that stage, they got in touch with Sporting. And it's you see, there are other managerial situations. You could mention potentially the situation with Graham Potter, who's now obviously at West Ham. You can't. There were issues there. Was he going to go somewhere else? Could they agree a compensation deal with regards to the pay that he was still getting for Chelsea? United went in, and within a day, they'd agreed terms with Amorim. Now, the hold-up, as we reported, was because he had this notice period in his contract. But again, there are sensible, grown-up people dealing with the football operation at United. And there was an international break coming up, so they came to the agreement that they would shorten that notice period, and they would take into consideration the international break. And he would get the opportunity to say goodbye to Sporting Lisbon, where obviously, he's adored by the supporters, and they've already got rid of his successor. So I think the Manchester United that we're seeing now is swift and effective. And we're yet to see the results, but the early indications from Amorim are certainly that he seems to be the right choice.
And of course, Ruben Amorim is seemingly driving the situation regarding Marcus Rashford. So we'll turn our attention to matters on the field. What's your latest understanding of Marcus Rashford's future?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, Ben. The latest I'm told is that, and obviously the disclaimer is that these things can change pretty quickly, but expect this one to run deep into the transfer window. It won't surprise anyone to know that the wages are a stumbling block. We're talking around £350,000 a week, and it's quite a complex situation. So United obviously don't want him to go to another club in England at this stage, because they are wary of the optics of how that would look if he was to go there and do well. Jesse Lingard is fresh in the memory. He's in South Korea now, but he went to West Ham and did well there, and had people questioning the wisdom of United's decision to allow him to go. So there's the geography, for want of a better word, and the logistics, I suppose, of to where United are comfortable with him going. On the wages front, it's finding that agreement. So my understanding is that United are not guiding in conversations how much they will accept to allow him to go out of the door until the end of the season, which is in their interests. It's down to clubs to come to them with a proposal, and then they'll go away and see whether it's something that works for them and for the player. I think it gets lost a little bit as well that this is a guy who is synonymous with Manchester United. And I think the current situation, it's important not to let that cloud the whole picture. So Marcus Rashford has been very well paid, but he's also been a great servant for Manchester United. He has had periods of success. He is a local boy. He has come through the academy. He's a United fan. He really should be everything, represent everything that is right about Manchester United. And there are good people at that football club. And there's also an element in the background that this has to be done correctly. So whether you agree with the interview that he carried out recently, the way that some people perceive him to have conducted himself, he is still part of the Manchester United family. And there is a desire to do the right thing by the player. But obviously, as we've seen, under the current regime at Manchester United, the performance of the first team comes first. So going back to what I said at the start, the latest information I'm getting is that this may well run deep into the transfer window.
So Rashford could be one departure out the door at Manchester United. What about some of the other players, Mike? Alejandro Garnacho is being linked with Napoli because Kvicha Kvaratskhelia is on his way to PSG. Casemiro in Saudi Arabia seems to still be a topic of conversation. Are we going to see a flurry of sales in January?
I think in an ideal world you would. Ben, do you play Football Manager, the game?
I do play Football Manager, much more so than five-a-side.
So this is probably a very, very sad omission, right? But when you go on Football Manager, say if you were to take over Manchester United, and immediately you'd look at that squad and you'd sort it by which players are in your thoughts and which players aren't, and then you'd look at the salaries and you'd be like, right, you'd identify 4 or 5 players, because as we know, Manchester United are up against it with PSR, and there is a limit on how much they can spend. So the obvious solution is to get those high earners off the books. And you try and sell them on Football Manager, Ben, and if it's anything like me, nobody will get anywhere near to what the board will step in and they'll block it because you're trying to sell them for not enough. They want more money for them. So then what certain people might do is set up another manager who takes over at a Premier League rival, who buys all those players and gets them out the door. And then you resign as that manager and you crack on with it at Manchester United and you've got them all off the wage bill. Sadly, for them, this isn't Football Manager and you can't do that. So at this point, there are people at Old Trafford who are seriously earning their money trying to get these players out of the club. So it's tricky because, and this is through no fault of their own, a lot of those players are on big money, and it's finding a destination that isn't going to kill United, as we said with Marcus Rashford. You know, they're not going to go to another club in the Premier League and show them up and damage United's own standing in the Premier League. But it's also somebody who is going to be able to give United what makes it a worthwhile deal, shall we say. And it's very rare in this day and age that you would, if you're trying to get a player out on loan, that you'll find someone to come in and pay 100% of their wages. So at that case, it's how much is it palatable for United to take? And that's where they're at. You know, I know you've got great contacts in Saudi Arabia. We've both spent time there ourselves. Casemiro, Saudi Arabia seems to be the only direction that one's going. My information from Saudi Arabia is that this isn't going to be a massive window over there with regards to the investment. Expect to see a lot more trade done in the summer than in this transfer window. So that may impact on Casemiro. With regards to the others, Garnacho, I don't think there's a massive desire to sell him, but as you know, if a bid comes in at a certain level, every player's got his price. We've spoken about the Rashford situation. With regards to incomings, you know, it's kind of, they're going to have to try and get creative. My strong guidance from people who work at United is that maybe there might be 1 or 2 who will come in on loan if it works, but don't expect huge movement, because unless things change, and obviously that can happen, at this moment in time, it isn't looking like there's going to be a lot of traffic.
And just 2 final questions, Mike. Kobbie Mainoo, a lot of talk about Chelsea potentially being interested. Do you sense that that's some posturing from all sides, and that a new deal now Ahmad has signed at Manchester United is the most likely situation? Or because of this so-called pure profit that Mainoo could generate on the books, could there be the possibility of a Kobbie Mainoo outgoing in 2025?
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. Being an old cynic, I don't think the fact that there's talk of a contract and then all of a sudden there's talk of interest from elsewhere at Chelsea, I struggle to see that being a coincidence. Kobbie Mainoo, I spoke about this with Marcus Rashford. He's a Manchester boy. He's everything that's good about Manchester United and the academy. You know, he's come through the ranks. He's represented England already. He slots into that midfield. And I think, you know, we've seen it at Anfield. We've seen the beginnings of a partnership with Ugarte in that midfield. So I don't see why you would want to get rid of that when you're in a situation where, especially in midfield, you need as many good players as you can get. Having said that, going back to your point about the pure profit and the impact on PSR, if a crazy bid came in from Kobbie Mainoo, then would United be able to stomach that? Because they would look at it and, Ruben Amorim will know his targets. He will know, who he wants to bring in, what are the areas that need strengthening. I mean, fullback is the obvious one. But if it's a case of, say, for the money that they get for Kobbie Mainoo, Ruben Amorim can then go and bring in 3 players that he thinks will make the team better than it would be, and it would kind of deal with that loss of Mainoo, and they would still come out the other side with a stronger squad, then who knows? But I just find it unlikely. I don't think there's an appetite to sell him. I know that Chelsea are admirers of him, as we reported in the Mail, but I just don't see that appetite at United to sell unless there's a crazy offer, and I just don't see a crazy offer.
And just finally, Mike, let's move our attention to the blue side of Manchester. What do you think has gone wrong for Man City this season? And is Pep Guardiola, having signed a new deal, under any kind of pressure heading towards the end of the season? Could we see, despite that new deal, still a summer departure if it just feels like it's not working between all parties?
I mean, it's the Premier League and they're the 4 times in a row champions, so there'll always be an element of pressure. But what I would say with Pep Guardiola, given the standing that he has held in at Manchester City, quite rightly, given the success that he's brought to the club, I would be absolutely amazed if him leaving Manchester City is anything other than his own decision. So if he looks at it and thinks, you know what, this we've had a great run. I know I signed the new contract, but I think it's for everyone's interest that we freshen things up and somebody else comes in and I'm going. And he goes with a fanfare that he quite rightly deserves. That I can only imagine will be the only way it plays out. I can't see Man City turning around and saying to Pep, you're going to have to go, this isn't working. I don't see that. I think it's a fascinating one because we know that it's very difficult in the Premier League, given the money that everybody has, to create a period of sustained success. There's a reason why City were the first to become 4 in a row champions. I think I wouldn't like to say that there's a complacency because he knows his players, he trusts his players, but certainly now you're looking back at that summer window and you're thinking, did we do enough business? I think the age of the squad in certain areas is catching up with them. I think, the Kyle Walker situation is fascinating. He's on 93 England caps. He desperately wants to get to 100 England caps, and he's clearly decided that isn't going to happen at Manchester City. And you can't blame him because we know that Pep is looking at bringing in defensive reinforcements, and we're already in a position where Walker's struggling to make the first 11. So I think it all boils down to, does Pep have the appetite for a rebuild at this stage? Personally, from a very selfish point of view, I'd have preferred him to have left at the end of the season and taken the England job, because if you're Pep, you can then turn around and if he's successful with England, say, I have completed football. I am the greatest manager that there has ever been. I've done it in Spain. I've done it in Germany. I've done it in England, but nobody's done it ever before with Manchester City. And now, guess what? To put the cherry on the icing on top of the cake, I've even won a major tournament for England. And that hasn't happened. It's not a perfect world. It's a fascinating one. Just little things like the game at Brentford. They go 2-0 up, Foden scores twice, and you think, right, they're back on track now. And then it's not surprising that Brentford come back and equalise all of a sudden. So maybe the appetite is there for Pep. Maybe he looks at this and thinks, you know what, this stokes the fires again. Because he often spoke about how difficult it was to kind of motivate his players to repeat success with success. So now that success isn't there, maybe he's looking at that and thinking this actually makes it easier to motivate the players. And as we are aware, they are looking at doing business in this window. So maybe at the end of the window, it looks like a Manchester City that's had some new life injected into it.
Fascinating stuff, Mike. Really appreciate you coming on and joining us and speaking about the blue half and the red half of Manchester, and of course your beloved Oldham, and good luck to them for the rest of the season. But for now, thanks for joining us.
Cheers, Ben.
Mike Keegan there, sports news correspondent for the Daily Mail. He's dropping exclusives by the second or the minute. So make sure that you follow him, and his personal handle as well on X is Mike Keegan _DM, which stands for Daily Mail. So check out his content on the Daily Mail website and on all platforms. And of course, right here as well on Market Madness.